So, thank you, Dinesh. This talk is an attempt to bring together various of the things that we've been doing over in Europe in the involving the APA, and I hope it touches on many of the things that have come up before. But I've got the opportunity here to just bring out a few specific concepts. So, and apologies to those who've seen some of these slides. Some of you may have seen all of these slides, and I apologize even more to you. So digital preservation. It occurred to me some time ago that this is true. Unfortunately, it was quickly followed by this thought. And then, you know, I've been involved with audit and certification, and when I began thinking about that, this thought occurred to me. But unfortunately then, shortly afterwards, I realized that there was an implication there. So, because of those following thoughts, it raised a whole load of other issues that needed to be thought about. And these are some of the things that have been talked about during this conference. Lots of questions about preservation. A term that comes up, metadata. The key question often, it seems to me, is what kind of metadata and how much? I mean, in answer to that sort of question, all of OAIS had developed. Now, there are, of course, and again touched on very clearly by many of the previous speakers, lots of difficulties in digital preservation and lots of different sorts of objects. Now, many of you clearly deal with specific types of objects, say PDFs, PDFA, to be even more specific, or JPEGs. Now, if you're absolutely confident that that's all you'll ever deal with, then you can probably stop listening to me. Okay, I'll continue then, because it seemed to me, especially coming from my background, that there's a lot more to the world than PDFA, JPEGs, TIFFs, and so forth. So I lumped them under the general heading of data. I tend to think of scientific data, but there are all sorts of new things coming out, and I think it's credible to expect that those of us who preserve these things, attempt to preserve these things, will be asked to preserve these new sorts of objects. So it's clear that the world is getting more and more complicated, no longer simple Word files, but Word files linked together with Visual Basic applications, programs in there, dependencies on things out there on the internet that quite often you or the end user has no idea about. XML schemas out there, things that are downloaded by the software that you're completely unaware of. So things will undoubtedly keep evolving. And unless you can control your environment, then if you're in that very fortunate position, then you have to start worrying about it. There are tools and services. Many have been talked about in the previous presentations. None of them solve all problems, and generally one has to pull together a selection of tools that work for you. But how do you know which ones work for which digital objects? So this is one of the other key questions that has driven the work that I've been involved with. and which things work together well. And of course, we must expect change. So new tools will come out, just as there'll be new types of objects. How do we deal with them? Do we have to start from scratch every time, or is there some coherent view that will not? I think it would be too much for such a view to provide all the answers, but at least to provide some sensible guidance that has a good likelihood of working. It's not guaranteed, but we need something, it seems to me. We also need trained personnel, come up time and time again, but those personnel, I mean, it's reasonable again to expect a periodic updates in their skills, but they will have to address and come to produce some answers to lots of questions, lots of different challenges. How is there a way of adapting the training so that it will help them meet those challenges? And again, there are many solutions have been presented, but I think it's reasonable to say that none of them are risk-free, and all of them have a cost. Now, what's the balance between them? So how can that be approached? And of course, my favorite question, who can you trust to answer all these things? So we have a number of useful things to hand. So OEIS gives us some concepts. I'll show you in a few slides the answer to the bulk of these questions that we've come up with in Parson, and you've heard a lot about the ISO 16363 standard. Now, it seems to me that there are many claims, as I said in the first slide, that people can claim all sorts of things. Personally, I'm quite a suspicious character. So I kind of like evidence. You know, people say, well, this will work for your type of object. I like evidence. So when we what we've been trying to do is to accumulate evidence in different ways. But of course, if you want to have something that'll help you address things that we haven't yet thought about, we need some way of forcing ourselves to look at different sorts of example data. So there are many different possible ways of classifying things. I tend to initially look at rendered data, so that would be things that you'd normally, if you've preserved it successfully, you put it on a screen or you print it. If it looks the same as the original, then you've done a good job. But there are other things that I would tend to call non-rendered, so especially scientific data or formulae in spreadsheets, things like that, which normally you want to do things with. You can also look at composite versus simple. There's another way of saying that the file formats that that are developed year by year tend to be much more container files, containing many individual types of objects, often completely different from what you have prima facie in the object itself. So, for example, you might have, I think I mentioned yesterday, ActiveX components in what look like quite simple Word files. You can also think of things that are dynamic versus things that are static. Seems slightly odd to talk about that in terms of digital preservation, but quite often you have things that are changing, for example, transactional databases, and it's important to know what the state was at a particular time. And again, you might expect different techniques to apply for these things. Active versus passive. A simple example of that is an application. We've seen, I think Jamie was talking about software that needs to be preserved versus the data that the software acts on. So there are lots of different ways of classifying objects, and you can look at it like this, or you can look at it from a data warehousing point of view and just throw in all the possible classifications you can think of, and try then under these different headings to test tools to see what evidence can be accumulated. We also need to look at the many different types of threats, because there are many different ways, not just technical obsolescence, not just hardware or software obsolescence. So this is, I hope, will give you a little idea, or else you may find it completely confusing. So you can think of three of those different binary divisions, say rendered, non-rendered, static, active, and complex and simple, and think about what a point in that 3D space might be. So this might be, this would be rendered and simple, so a simple digital object. This would be static and non-rendered, so maybe a scientific object, an Earth observation image. I mean, clearly that can be rendered, but that's not its primary purpose, because if you render that and then save only the rendering, then you've lost all the useful information. You can look at different types of objects. Now, libraries often say, and I think we've heard it said essentially in these terms, emulate or migrate. Now, again, this, for certain repositories, should work fine. If you're dealing with things that are rendered, absolutely fine. If you're looking at something that's where you're looking at the I'll start with emulation. I think it's true to say that what that allows you to do is to more or less repeat what's been done before. But if we look, and especially if we're thinking about value, remember the slide previously, data is the new gold, but gold is valuable because it doesn't change, there's not much of it, otherwise it wouldn't be valuable. And it's inert, it doesn't combine with things, hence it doesn't rust. Whereas data is valuable because there's so much of it, and it gets more valuable if you combine it with other things. So if you simply emulate, it's hard to add value. If you migrate, then again, if it's a fairly simple thing, you want to go from Word to PDF, absolutely fine. I have nothing against that. But I think for other sorts of objects, you have to think, well, what should I convert to? If you want to serve multiple communities, what format do you convert to? And if you want to, again, add value to maybe hundreds of different communities who use hundreds of different file formats,